in procurement, negotiation typically runs on a more positional bargaining approach. I think, my understanding would come to the fore, and it's really around a more competitive approach. You talk about competitive pitches, or there's bids and tenders and the other issues to go with it. It doesn't typically align with what we know as collaborative win-win negotiations or mutual gains negotiations. Now, generally the rules are set by the other party when they go through the issue around competitive pitching and those areas. And that puts you at a disadvantage, I suppose, to actually negotiate with them. What would you suggest as really those game-changing strategies, or how you would introduce strategies that can move you more to that win-win collaborative approach?
That's a big question.
It was.
we could spend the rest of the time together talking about that one too. Listen, let me tell you a story to sort of illustrate this. I can remember, and you're right. I mean, listen. I mean, I think the vast majority of negotiation training, if you go and do negotiation training anywhere in the world, the vast majority of what you will be taught is what I call relationship-based negotiation, where you're negotiating with an individual. It's it's an exchange of views. It's you've got potential for value creation depending on what it is you're doing, and the vast majority of training concentrates on that. And I can remember back in the day when I was running the procurement team at WPP, we launched a major centrally led, centrally driven negotiation training program, because WPP is a very complex organization. It's almost like it's like a parent company center with like a confederation of advertising agencies and media companies and digital businesses and whatever. So, this was like a centrally led training and coaching initiative, and we got the best academics in the world and all the rest of it. Anyway, we'd been doing this for about 4 or 5 years, and it was all fabulous. And I remember having lunch with one of the global CFOs of one of the biggest businesses we had in New York, and he was saying, "Tom, this is fabulous. We're loving it. Our people think it's great. You're doing a great job." He said, "The trouble is it doesn't work." And I said, "What do you mean it doesn't work? I've spent 5 years doing this stuff and it's great and whatever." And he said, "Well, he said, it all goes to shit." Am I allowed to say that? It all goes to shit when we're in a I'm Scottish, I can say anything. It all goes to shit when we're in a competitive pitch situation and the client, particularly procurement teams, are putting pressure on, and we're just getting played one off against the other, and none of this negotiation stuff works. And that really started me thinking, and I got quite frustrated at that. Because I thought, it has to work. And why do people have so much difficulty when it comes to competitive pitching? And of course, I'm almost holding a mirror up to myself as a procurement professional and saying, what is it that I'm doing, or we as a function that are doing, which is actually constraining the ability potentially to create value in a competitive pitch situation? So it really started a train of thought going. And that was one of the main reasons why Hal Movies and I published that paper, because we couldn't really find anything that was particularly relevant or cast a light, if you like, on that particular challenge, particularly when procurement are the process game setters. You're absolutely right. Procurement are setting the rules of the game, and I thought quite deeply about my own experience, because this comes down to power, doesn't it? Who has the power? And oftentimes I find this quite an interesting topic, because if I ask a bunch of procurement people, as you're coming up to these negotiations, you're just about to come up with these suppliers, how much power do you actually feel you've got versus that? And they'll often say, "Oh, these are professional sellers. These people know what they're doing. They definitely have the power." And then you ask the suppliers, and the suppliers say, "Oh, these procurement people are tough. These clients, they've always got the power because they can always spend the money elsewhere." Everybody thinks everyone else has the power in negotiations. It is absolutely astonishing. And the minute when I'm doing simulation-based training, the minute I give someone a brief that says you are the client in this simulation, I can almost see the shoulders going back. I can almost say like, yeah, I'm going to be the client this time. So power is a very perceptual thing. And what I always say to people is, look, just because someone is a client doesn't automatically give them the power over anything. Just because you're the supplier doesn't mean that you have less power than the client does. Power is entirely perceptual, and you have as much power as the other side perceives you have. And if you then take that into competitive pitch type environment, And I can look back to, again, my experience of doing this. Remember, working in a complex organization, I've got multiple stakeholders, whether it's in my time in pharma or my time in advertising agencies and that sort of stuff. I've got multiple people who need to buy into this approach. And I can guarantee, because very often we would be putting together, rather than appointing a single supplier for a project, we would often be putting together what you would call a preferred supplier list or agencies of record or that sort of thing, where the business would appoint 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever to give internal choice, around who people wanted to work with. From a risk perspective, I mean, procurement, sorry, I'm jumping around here a little bit, but from a procurement point of view, there are 4 things procurement really cares about. I mean, listen, around procurement 30 years, the basics haven't changed. Fundamentals haven't changed. There are 4 things procurement cares about: value, cost, cash, and risk. Yeah, value is self-explanatory. How much value can I bake into a deal through negotiation or through the game that we're playing? By value, I mean non-price related value. Cost is price, clearly. Cash is payment terms, and in many geographies and whatever, that is a major issue. Risk is the one that everyone thinks about, and risk for procurement has a number of different elements to it. But let's just say for now, and we might come back to that. Let's just say for now that procurement does worry about risk, when it's coming to making decisions. Now, all of that gets baked into, the whole RFP type approach. But I think back to it and I think, we would go out to maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever it was, suppliers as part of a major pitch. I guarantee the internal stakeholders would already have their favorites. They would already have those 2 or 3 suppliers that you would say there was a strong likelihood one of those 2 or 3 was likely to either win or be part of that preferred supplier list. There was probably another 2 or 3 that they were keen to take a look at. Maybe some of the smaller stakeholders were keen to see them, but there was maybe not quite so much support, but another 2 or 3 who were, in a strongish position. There was probably another 2 or 3 who, realistically probably were not going to win the pitch, but they were there because we knew they would drive competitive leverage. We knew they would drive sharp pricing. So effectively, you've got the strong favourites, you've got the middle ground, you've got the sharp pricing ones, and there's your ideal pitch scenario. But what I can guarantee is not all of those had an equal chance of winning. And I think that from when you're thinking about this from a supplier point of view, that's the first thing I would say in terms of thinking about. Think about the setup of all of this. Yeah. Think about, when you look at the request for proposal document as it comes in, everyone gets excited about the opportunity. What's the RFP saying? What's the opportunity, the size of it, and all the revenue and whatever. The first place I go when I get an RFP document is page 75. Because on page 75, you're going to find a little section that says, this is how the originator of the RFP, the client, this is how the client is going to make the decision. There's going to be a little section in there that's going to be called business requirements. And those business requirements can be very, very telling because that's basically saying the business requirements should be an amalgamation of all of those internal interests in terms of this is against these business requirements, we will be assessing the various suppliers. And if you as a supplier go to that list and be honest with yourself and say, look, how well do I think I fit this business requirement set? That's going to tell you something.
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, you can do is you can then challenge the rules of the game. Now, what I mean by that is, as the procurement team, we spend ages setting up these complex bid documents and processes are going to run like this, and here's the milestones and whatever else as well. We want responsive back by then, and then we're going to do this and that. That's all laid down in black and white, and a lot of suppliers kind of nod and yes, yeah, we've got to submit the response in that spreadsheet in that way, and oh God, it's all terribly constrained, and we feel like a commodity because we can't demonstrate our differentiation because it's so constrained. And I'm like, well, actually, what if you don't? What if you don't do what they're asking you to do? And I use the words a lot. If I do this, or if I don't do this, who has the problem? I talk a lot about problem transfer in negotiation because every choice has a consequence in negotiation. And negotiation, in many ways, whether it's hostage resolution or commercial stuff that I do, it's all about choices and the consequences of those choices. And as you know, Peter, we have many more choices in negotiations as we often think we do, or inexperienced negotiators think they do. They default into almost like a pre-programmed way of doing something as opposed to taking a step back and saying, well, what are the choices? And if I make those choices, what are the consequences? And if you take a step back and think about it, and this has happened to me many times over the years, if I am one of those 2 or 3 suppliers who probably have an inside track in this pitch, because of our relationships with the key stakeholders or the strengths we have or whatever, if I'm one of those 2 or 3 and I don't like some of the rules of the game that procurement, or I don't like the process that procurement are setting out, what if I just tell them that? What if I just say, well, look, actually, yes, we will respond by that date, but we're not going to respond that way. We're going to respond this way. Who now has the problem? Well, I'm as a procurement person, I've then got to go back to my internal stakeholders and say, well, this great supplier that you want to be part of this pitch and who you think has a great chance of winning is not prepared to play ball. Are you prepared to kick them out of this game? Because if you're not, I have a problem because my game is now no longer working. And nobody would ever kick out these suppliers, in my experience. So procurement then ends up having to change and mold and shape and whatever the game itself. The game is as much negotiable as the substantive elements of a deal are negotiable, provided you're one of those suppliers who the client wants to be part of the game. If you're not, then you've got to think about the chances of winning. Yeah. What is the likely win ratio of your pitches? If you're unlikely to be in the top 3 or 4 as things stand at the beginning, how likely is your win ratio? And therefore, what's the choice we have here? If we push back and we get kicked out, or if we agree to rules we don't like and then spend the next 3 months and a huge amount of time and expense and effort and energy, going through a pitch that we were never going to win in the first place, well, what's the choice there? You know, and I think my advice to people is, look, if you're desperate to do a pitch, then God, fine, do it. If you're absolutely desperate to do it, but challenging the pitch rules, or at least suggesting you might not submit a response for whatever reason, is a great way to actually test how seriously the client is taking you, particularly if the client has gone to a big range of suppliers. If there's only 2 or 3 people pitching, that's one thing. If there's 6 or 7 or 8 people pitching, that's a very different thing. Indeed. So a lot of this for me is actually about you have more power than you think you do in the opening stages of a pitch. And I think good advice generally to suppliers, to vendors, is play with that. Play with it and see where it takes you. Because it certainly gets more difficult as you get into the pitch. And you're starting to expend dollars and effort and energy and travel time and whatever. That perception of power certainly changes once you get into the sort of guts of the pitch itself.
That was well covered, Tom. And I know that last little bit we were talking about, just in my mind, is thinking about rather than accepting something or you need to do the deal and you come away with a suboptimal outcome, or the other issue is then you strive to renegotiate the game as well. And just to look at that, if you're out and it's a suboptimal outcome, you're not losing anything. So you really make that effort and test the waters at the same time. So I think that was really sound advice and drawn from a lot of experience. Kinnaird Negotiation is your business, and is there anything you would like to cover there about reaching out to the audience or prospective clients that want to get in touch with you?
No, other than just drop me an email, go to the website. I can be contacted through through either. I love a challenge, and
Right.
I love helping bring this stuff to life. That's what really gives me the buzz. It's not so much the teaching element; it's the actually bringing it to life. So I thoroughly enjoy it.
Thanks, Tom.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invite, Peter.